Penn State men's basketball gets better again. Jameel Brown, one of the Micah Shrewsbury freshmen, is staying and is going to be a part of Mike Rhoades' plan. Why he stayed, it's actually a lot simpler than you might expect. And what the heck is Jalen DeLoach doing?
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Zach Seyko, your host, and I am joined by contributor for Black Shoe Diaries, SB Nation, Pat Koerbler on the other side. Pat, it's great to see you again. Recent basketball news. Penn State fans should feel very good about this.
Yeah, as always, thank you for having me on, Zach. Always a great time to come on the Locked On Nittany Lions podcast. And yeah, despite the fact that this past weekend was definitely more focused on Penn State football and was a football weekend in Happy Valley. Very important weekend for basketball too. So yeah, excited to talk about the news.
Yeah, Jameel Brown announces he's coming back. That's a win. The situation with Jalen DeLoach, we're going to get into all of it. And Locked On Nittany Lions is your go-to for Penn State rivals, your go-to podcast now. Visit pennstate.rivals.com or happyvalleyinsider.com for your source for all things Penn State athletics. Okay, Jameel Brown's sticking around. Mike Rhoades is able to secure a recommitment out of him. And I was a little surprised just because of the relationship where he's from. He's out of state. He followed Micah Shrewsbury to Purdue, then decommitted, and then ultimately committed to Penn State and played the 1 year. And then Adam Fisher, who we know just behind the scenes had a great relationship with Jameel, and goes to Temple. He made that visit. I guess it wasn't good enough. And then he ultimately sticks in Happy Valley. So what is the takeaway from this? Why did Jameel Brown felt like he fit in best with Mike Rhoades' new plan for the Nittany Lions?
It's a great question. One I unfortunately don't know the full answer to, just because, like you were saying, right? Jameel has such a connection to Micah. He was committed to basically him at Purdue. He's a Philly kid. He played at Haverford and then his last season at Westtown. So obviously he's going to have a relationship with Adam Fisher, who even prior to coming to Penn State when he was at Miami was really big in getting guys like Isaiah Wong to Miami, being that they were Northeast guys. Sounded like, or it's reported that Brown did visit Temple. And I think, just for you and I, and really for anybody, that's going to obviously kind of stick out as, a point of contention that he would potentially be going to Temple. But yeah, it worked out in Penn State's favor in the end. Why that's the case, it's only us speculating. I think it's probably a combination of things, right? Like first and foremost, and we talked about this on a previous podcast, just like as people, it can be tough to, if you're Jameel Brown or if you're Mahaffey or if you're Kebba, if you're whoever, Kanye, Clary, you spend this 1 year at Penn State and you're starting to get comfortable, right? You get over that freshman hump that I think, any freshman goes through, whether they're an athlete or a non-athlete. And then it can be trying to then have to pick up the pieces and move somewhere again and go through that process again. So I think for Jameel, not knowing, right, if he was going to follow Shrewsbury to Notre Dame or if he was going to follow Fisher to Temple, kind of not knowing exactly what his role was going to be. And not that that's necessarily the case at Penn State, but I think he probably looked at it from the perspective of no matter where I'm going, I'm not going to know exactly what my role is going to be, right? Compared to somebody like Kebba, who is probably going to have a better idea if he decides to go to Notre Dame, what his role is going to be, or even Evan, guys who played a little bit more last year. Jameel is basically starting at the ground level no matter where he's at. So it kind of makes some sense to stay at Penn State where he's comfortable with. And I think even from his perspective, right, we watch what Mike Rhoades is doing in the portal and knowing that there's going to be so much turnover on this roster and that Brown, all things considered, has a pretty good chance of at least being in the rotation here. So a combination of things, right? Not everything is black and white when it came to this decision, but I think it really just came down to Jameel Brown being comfortable at Penn State and obviously comfortable in what Mike Rhoades and his staff were offering him.
Very well put. I think that, familiarity had a lot to do with it. You're jumping from school location to location to location. This would be your third different place of basketball because you go from high school senior to Penn State freshman to now a redshirt freshman somewhere completely different with a new staff regardless, because Micah Shrewsbury didn't take his whole staff with him to Notre Dame. So yeah, you were losing. I think if Micah was able to maintain a majority of his staff, I know Mike Fairley's going with him, but and Adam Fisher in Jameel Brown's case is going to Temple, then that's an all new staff that you've never worked with. Those are all new players. Same thing at Notre Dame. Maybe you take a Kebba Njie with you and Evan Mahaffey. We'll get to them in just a second. But as far as Jameel Brown's situation goes, Kanye Clary's still there. Demetrius Lilly at 99%. I don't think he's going in the portal, but he's just been so quiet and he hasn't entered the portal to this point that he's going to stay in Happy Valley. And Jameel Brown's like, well, I played a year here. I also played in a year under Micah and Adam's system. For the most part, it was Micah's, but Adam definitely had a lot of influence being the associate head coach, Micah's right-hand man. And he probably sat back and said, I didn't play a whole lot. And I get it. Jalen Pickett was there, and you had a lot of guys that were caught up in the backcourt. You saw Dalian Johnson slide down in terms of minutes, non-existent at all. And I feel like Jameel Brown might have stepped back and said, maybe in Mike Rhoades' system, I might be able to flourish more than I could have in Micah Shrewsbury. And that's okay to make that assessment.
Yeah, and I think it's also a case of, although the NCAA and their rules are kind of depends upon the situation, but knowing that you do only have that one transfer before you graduate. Yeah. So if you're Jameel and you're not 100% sure on what's going to happen at Notre Dame, or not 100% sure at what's going to happen at Temple or whatever schools we're looking at them, you can go back to Penn State, see what Mike Rhoades is like, and next year Jameel can decide, hey, now I want to enter the transfer portal and still have that option. If he decided to go to another school, if he decided to go to Temple, that isn't necessarily going to be the case. He's kind of stuck there until he graduates. I know that you can, with the NCAA, it's kind of like sometimes they grant waivers, sometimes they don't. But I just think for Jameel, at least for right now, for the next year, it kind of made sense for him to stick at Penn State with, like we were saying, that familiar nature.
It is Locked On Nittany Lions, Pat Koerbler, Black Shoe Diaries. Joining me on the show, we're talking Penn State men's basketball. Jalen DeLoach kind of makes a different decision. He hasn't decided on a place. He's decided on actually the 180 of making a decision. And before we get to that, plus Kebba Njie, Evan Mahaffey, and so much more, your thoughts on blue-white, Pat. Let's hear from one of our sponsors for today's episode, and that is Built. Something exciting is coming to Built.com on April 22nd. And I don't have all the details yet, but the excitement is real, and it's something you won't want to miss out on. If you know how Built works, they have the most incredible protein bars in the world, and they do these amazing flavor drops with unreal flavors in limited quantity. So mark your calendars and head to Built.com on Saturday, April 22nd to be one of the first to discover what all the hype is about. And I can't wait to see what the new flavor is. Make sure you use promo code LOCKEDON15. That is LOCKEDON15, and you'll get 15% off of your order. And thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. Your go-to podcast for Penn State rivals. Visit HappyValleyInsider.com for everything Penn State athletics. Evan Mahaffey, Kebba Njie. It seems like things are going to get interesting there because at least the latest reports indicate, Evan Mahaffey's from Ohio and Kebba Njie is from Indiana. So at least as of Wednesday, April 19th, depending on when you're watching this, Kebba Njie is going to wrap up his recruiting visit at Notre Dame. And I would say that all things point to Notre Dame as the destination for Kebba Njie. Really came on at the end of his freshman season under Coach Shrewsbury's system. He's probably going to have an expanded role because Notre Dame's going through the same thing where the old players, some of them are exiting or going to other schools, and there's going to be a new foundation built. And at least it's going to be somewhat similar to what Coach Shrewsbury was doing at Penn State. So Kebba Njie to Notre Dame seems likely, but Penn State's still in the fold. And then for Evan Mahaffey, he's from Ohio. Dayton is making a very big push because that's where he's from, Dayton, Ohio. Then he visited Ohio State. I would really hate to see him make the Jamari Wheeler move, but I guess it's in the cards here. So what ultimately do you think happens with Njie and Mahaffey, Pat?
I'm kind of going along the line of thinking that going 5 for 5 with those freshmen, right, with Jameel, Kanye, Demetrius, and then Kebba and Mahaffey was generally pretty unrealistic. The fact that you could get 5 freshmen to stay and a couple of them that had pretty big roles last year, at least depends if you want to argue about Kebba and Mahaffey's role. But right, guys that were at least in the rotation in some sense as freshmen, and Kebba getting a couple starts or quite a few starts. I do basically agree with it. It seems pretty wrapped up that Kebba is most likely going to go to Notre Dame. And I do realize that like the idea of, well, Jalen DeLoach just visited Penn State from VCU, and now it seems like he's wide open. So shouldn't the same be true of Kebba, right? He's from Penn State. He's visiting Notre Dame, where his old coach is now coaching. It just seems more so that Jalen DeLoach is certainly enjoying the process and has tweeted out things like his top 6 and how he's open to visits and things like that. And Kebba is basically keeping things pretty on the down low. I know there was a report of schools that were interested in him, that were offering him. I think it was John Rothstein that reported that. But otherwise, it seems like Kebba is basically, this is pretty much a Penn State and Notre Dame decision, at least on the surface. And yeah, I don't think it's a good thing that he's visiting Notre Dame, for a day or two. So
yeah, exactly. 3 days almost.
Yeah. So it just seems like, Penn State was going to lose one of these guys, at least one of these guys. And Kebba, at least in my mind, was always just the most likely one, just because he was such a highly touted prospect. And Micah Shrewsbury was such a big reason why he came to Penn State, that him going to Notre Dame, which, like you said, has just as many roster holes as Penn State does right now. So he'll certainly have a role there, most likely a starting role. So yeah, I would, project or predict that Kebba would end up in Notre Dame. Mahaffey, who really knows? Another kid that's keeping it quiet. Both these Penn State kids are keeping it quiet. I've heard about the Dane situation, Ohio State, and I'm sure there's a couple other schools involved, but would have definitely been one of those you would have thought that if he's staying at Penn State, that he probably would have, made a decision within the same time frame as Kanye Clary and Jameel Brown, right after Blue and White weekend. And I know last weekend was basically a de facto official visit for the current Penn State guys, even though they already go to school here and still live here. So I think the longer this goes, the worse it is for Penn State and Mahaffey. But that's just simply me speculating based upon really nothing other than my gut. So I'm still hopeful that Mahaffey sticks around, just because I think he makes the most sense. I know we talked about Kanye Clary in the past, but I personally think that Mahaffey makes the most sense in Mike Rhoades' system. And I think staying here could do a lot of good versus, going to Dayton or Ohio State or even Notre Dame if they get involved. But so I'll stay optimistic and say that Mahaffey is still going to come to Penn State, although I will say that I would have thought that it would have been wrapped up sooner by now if that was going to be his decision, but who really knows what's going on? Unfortunately, we do not.
I'll agree with you there. I think that Evan Mahaffey is a lot more likely to stay than Kebba Njie. I would say that it's almost all but wrapped up, and it's down to Penn State and Notre Dame. I can echo that. I would say that it's down to the 3 of Penn State, Ohio State, Dayton, when it comes to Mahaffey. And Mahaffey, I don't think, is scheduled to take any more visits. So it really is basically hometown, or just don't do Ohio State. Don't do the Jamari Wheeler thing. If you can, go to Dayton. That's where I know you're from Ohio, but you are from, in fact, Dayton. So that's fine if you ultimately end up there. But now that's the other part of it. You mentioned Jalen DeLoach. What the heck is going on there? Because he had the visit, his teammates were there, Ace Baldwin taking pictures, Nick Kern, and then everything wraps up and he's like, my recruitment is completely wide open. So it got worse. How did everything go backwards here?
Once again, only Jalen DeLoach, and I'm guessing the Penn State staff too, knows exactly what transpired or what's happening.
NIL?
Potentially.
NIL?
The only thing, right, yesterday when it came out that, or I guess on Monday or Tuesday, maybe it was Monday, I don't quite recall when it came out about DeLoach, but regardless, when it came out that he was reopening everything, right, he had a top 6 of, I think, San Diego State, Miami, Florida State, return to VCU, Penn State, and Indiana, I think were the 6 schools. And once it came, or this, past couple days when it came out that he's completely reopening his recruitment and is open to all schools, and he tweeted that out as long as there's reports about it as well. It's just a bad sign. It said that Penn State is still under consideration, still involved, but just the buzz going into the weekend of him being there with Ace Baldwin and Nick Kern, right, his former teammates, and the fact that Penn State was getting that first official visit, and that there was, some buzz that he would be on commit watch, and then he comes out of it, and he not only is he still going to take all his visits, but he's like, forget about Indiana, San Diego State, Miami, etc. I'm open to anyone that's willing to talk. Just on the surface, that doesn't sound good. The transfer portal can work in really mysterious ways, and as things can look bleak, all of a sudden a 180 happens. So who really knows what's going to happen from here? But on the surface, that's not a great sign, right? If Kebba had gone to Notre Dame and came back and was like, I'm completely open, I think everybody would basically think, well, he's not going to Notre Dame. So
Yeah.
I can only, assume the same with DeLoach, unfortunately.
So DeLoach is kind of exploring. Well, Penn State's going to explore other options in the transfer portal as well. Zach Hicks from Temple has narrowed down his top 4: Temple, Penn State, Georgetown, and I think I'm missing another one.
UTEP, good old
UTEP.
UTEP.
Okay, UTEP. All right, he's down to 3.
Well, so there was it was a free article from 24/7 that came out. I think it was Temple's 24/7 site that came out on Tuesday with his dad saying that he and Zach Hicks's mom preferred Temple or UTEP, which I have to say, I
Okay. All right.
no offense to UTEP, I'm sure I've heard like pretty good things about it.
Great institution. Sure, why not?
Yeah, it's a nice little town. It's just Temple, Georgetown, Penn State, UTEP. It just seems a little weird.
Is
So
Hawaii in there too?
yeah, no, exactly. I mean, just like you could have given me
Wyoming.
If you would have said his top 4 involves Georgetown, Temple, Penn State, you could have given me 50, 60, 70 guesses of what the 4th team is. I don't think I'd get even close to UTEP. So I'm not sure the connection there. If they have like a Philly guy on staff, or Zach Hicks is originally from Camden, so basically Philly. If they have like a Jersey guy on staff, what the connection there is. But yeah, at least from dad's. And keep in mind, he did say that he hasn't like really talked with his son about it, that they were going to be doing that the next couple of days and hopefully come to a decision Thursday, which is today when this podcast is coming out. So we'll see. Zach, obviously, I assume, can make his own decision, but yeah, so perhaps don't count UTEP out like I think we were both doing prior to knowing that.
All right, good to know. So other targets for Penn State in the transfer portal, and it's official. Ace Baldwin and Nick Kern are both signed, so they can't walk back. Not at the moment, anyway. I guess they could do something crazy at the end of the night, but they're at least here for a year, right? And everything else that is going on. So who are some of the other? There's There's 2 guys that they're looking at right now that they want to bring in and think that they have legitimate shots. What can you tell us about that?
So the one player that we can talk about is Georgetown center. I believe it's pronounced Qudus Wahab. It might be Quidus Wahab. I'm not exactly 100% sure, but he's the Georgetown center that was one time Maryland center that's now a Georgetown center again. If people remember when Patrick Ewing saved his job back in 2021 when they won the Big East tournament, Wahab was a big part of that. 6'11", 245. Once again, another old school center. Back to the basket post game. He was a big part of helping Georgetown win that Big East title. On the year, he averaged 12.7 points per game and 8.2 rebounds. And during the Big East tournament and then their NCAA tournament, their appearance, I believe they lost to Oregon State. He averaged something like 16-9, 16-10. So I had a really big couple weeks. And after that, he decided that he would enter the transfer portal. He went to Maryland, where I can only assume that NIL was kind of a big factor there. While at Maryland, it was the season that they fired Mark Turgeon after a couple games. So they were kind of, despite the fact that they came in with really high expectations, they kind of puttered out as the year went along. He averaged 7 points and only 5.5 boards at Maryland that year in 19 to 20 minutes per game. So wasn't exactly what I think he was hoping for, and certainly what the Terrapins were hoping for. So after the season, he then transferred back to Georgetown. And again, this comes back to the whole, these guys can just constantly transfer sometimes. The NCAA seems like
if you get the waiver, the almighty waiver.
Like you get a random waiver, they're okay. So he then transferred back to Georgetown for this last season with Patrick Ewing and didn't really look all that much better compared to what he was doing at Maryland. He averaged just under 10 points a game this year and 7 rebounds. Again, not bad stats, right? If your center is going out there and is putting up 9 and 7 or 10 and 8, right? I think generally that's okay. It's just where he was at when he was a sophomore in 2021. He, was averaging almost 13 points and averaging almost 10 rebounds and had such a good, 2 or 3 week stint going into the Big East tournament, at the Big East tournament, and then in the NCAA tournament, that people thought, hey, maybe this is a potential NBA guy. And he's kind of taken a step back and hasn't progressed to that level. Certainly still, at least for Penn State, is going to be a starting quality center. So
yeah,
he's scheduled to visit. It's either this week or this weekend. I think it could be multiple days. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, 2 years ago, this would have been like massive getting Wahab. Now I think Penn State's going to be the kind of program that would be going after him. Power 5 or Power 6, I guess, in college basketball teams that are trying to make it into the tourney. So schools like Penn State should hopefully have a pretty good shot at him.
And there's one other guy. I mean, there's Darius Maddox who took his visit, but they're also targeting Quentin Malora Brown. Any indication about how likely they could get either of those guys?
Yeah, so Darius Maddox, Virginia Tech guard. He's originally from the Maryland area, so has strong ties to Jameel Brown, Penn State's associate head coach, who's originally from Baltimore himself. Maddox also then played at Oak Hill, which is where Josh Reeves played, one of the best prep schools in the country. Yep. So Maddox coming out of there was, a top 100 or borderline top 100 prospect. Looked pretty good at Virginia Tech. Had a really, really good sophomore season 2 years ago. And then this past season, he became a starter. Numbers kind of dipped a little bit, and then he left the program for personal reasons that were undisclosed. So we'll see what happens. He's another kid that I don't think he has any social media at all. I was trying to find over the weekend, his Instagram or find his Twitter, just because I saw that Ace Baldwin and Kern and DeLoach were all posting lots of Penn State stuff. And Migos, by the way, Quavo from Migos is also posting about Penn State because he must have a connection to DeLoach. So I just think another quiet kid that he might just out of thin air just commit, and he could be taking other visits, but would certainly be a nice option next to Ace Baldwin just because he can do a little bit of everything. He can shoot, he can create, catch and shoot, good length, 6'5", can play defense. So it would certainly be a good option next to Ace Baldwin.
Locked On Nittany Lions is now your go-to podcast for Penn State rivals. HappyValleyInsider.com. Take a visit over at the website for the latest in Penn State football, men's basketball news, and analysis. It is another Locked On Nittany Lions podcast as we go into the final segment. And Pat, just your overall takeaways in general. We'll keep this pretty condensed here. We did a lot of men's basketball talk, but football obviously stole the weekend with all the recruits in town. The blue team beat the white team, shocking there, but it was only 10-0. So I know that everyone's walking away with, well, the offense is not what it needs to be. And no, it's just the defense is really that good. What were your observations from a 10-0 blue control from start to finish?
I think like everybody else, it was the defense, just like you were saying. I think every year, every blue and white game, the offense always seems really far behind. So I don't necessarily put that much stock in. I think there's been years where it was high scoring, but it was also, didn't Franklin do like a weird like scoring system the one year where if you got like a certain amount of yards, you got points and things like that.
Three and out for the defense was essentially a safety.
Yeah, exactly. So I think generally speaking, the offense, blue and white games are never high scoring, even going back to the Paterno days. So I don't put too much, stock into the fact that the offense didn't look that good, because generally speaking, the offense is always going to be behind the defense, even when we get into the summer and we hear about, buzz coming out of camp or even James Franklin talking, and someone's always the defense is ahead of the offense. And obviously there's been a lot of elite offenses, dating back to the Moorhead days at Penn State. So I'm not greatly concerned about what the offense looked like. It was very vanilla version of the offense, which is going to be the case for any college. But main takeaways, I think like a lot of people loved what Tony Rojas looked like. I was a big fan of his coming out of high school. The only worry that I had was the fact that he was 195 pounds on his high school film, and who knows what his athleticism and his burst is going to look like once he adds the weight to play linebacker. And obviously he's now at 30 pounds, according to James Franklin. And I thought he looked really good. It's going to take some time, just like it did for Micah Parsons, just like it even did for Abdul Carter, till they really, break through the rotation and get lots of snaps. But he's the type of kid that I can see by year end, it being, he being right behind Curtis Jacobs and Abdul Carter for being the best linebacker on Penn State's roster. Like Deni Dennis Sutton, Amin Vanover, the fact that those guys are Penn State's 2 backup defensive ends is pretty crazy, because I think those 2 could start at a lot of different Big Ten schools. So defensive end looks really good. I loved Kevin Winston. Kevin Winston's one of my guys at safety.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, they weren't challenged really basically at all deep. I don't think Drew threw probably more than like 20 yards. So again, was a vanilla game plan. And I think the safeties and just the defense knew that in general, that they could attack the line of scrimmage. But like what we saw from Winston, big kid, athletic, really excited to see what he turns into the next couple years. So yeah, good blue and white game. I think it stinks that they got hit with the rain, just because I think Thursday and Friday were such like beautiful days, and then of course you get to the blue and white game and you get I don't know, was it downpouring?
A little to start. Everything cleared up. At least it was just kind of overcast for most of the game itself. But it poured, and then as soon as 2 o'clock rolled around, weather was perfect. It was playable. We'll say that.
So yeah, what were your takeaways other than the weather?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it. I have other episodes around this, right? Appreciate you asking me, but I think Drew Allar, everything you said, Deni Dennis Sutton stood out, and James Franklin called him a starter. Essentially, I know he's not going to, but he will play starter reps when all said and done, even if he's not the first defensive end on the field. It's going to be Chop and Adisa Isaac, but Deni will rotate in a lot. Same thing, observations about Tony Rojas. So everything you said, you heard it here first, folks, on Locked On Nittany Lions from Pat about Tony Rojas. Tamir Robinson, to see him play after all just the crap and bad luck that he's been through, to see him play and make some freshman mistakes, but go toe to toe up and down the field. And, as I'm watching the highlights back and kind of going through all my notes and rehashing some stuff, I just think ultimately the most important takeaway, it's not the biggest or the sexiest or the most controversial, but Drew Allar's the starter. There's no more competition. And I don't know how, I'm not saying it wasn't serious, but Drew is just, and everyone says, well, he was facing the scout team and Bo had to go up against the first team. It's like, yeah, that was the case, but the nuances of Drew, yes, not playing with the scout offense that they wanted to see the chemistry on full display, and just Drew just kind of conducted himself a lot better. I think the biggest thing is just the way that he sees the football field. He's just a better football player than Bo. I think Bo is a gamer, but when it comes to X's and O's, this is the case of Tommy Stevens and Trace McSorley all over again. McSorley was the better quarterback when it came to analyzing defenses. And I think that's just the case with Drew. Drew went through his progressions perfectly. He didn't get spooked. Again, I know the pressure wasn't in his face all the time, but just the way he's able to maneuver in the pocket. Bo just kind of just takes off, bails out, and I like that Allar's not afraid to stay where he's comfortable rather than, and that's just the difference. Bo can run, but Bo can run. So I'm not surprised that he's going to scramble and utilize that asset of his legs. But Drew, comfortable in the pocket. The reason they scored that touchdown was because he went to his first option, wasn't there. Second option wasn't there. Third option wide open, Amari Evans. So that's how you have the touchdown. But Drew shows veteran-like qualities in a 19-year-old quarterback.
Yeah, I had to do it on a rewatch just because I'm also a big Sixers fan. They were on at the same time, so playoffs took a precedent.
How dare you?
Took precedent over a scrimmage, but I just had some friends that were like, Drew didn't look that great. I thought he looked, I mean, yes, we all wanted him, like we were talking about, we all want him to go out and throw 3 touchdowns and not have any incompletions, but I thought that all the good things that we're excited about Drew basically showed, right? Just like you talked about, how he's able to move in the pocket, how he's able to go through progressions and keep his eyes downfield, and just his ability for him. I feel like he doesn't get flustered, even going back to last year when he got thrown into that Purdue game and they showed him on the sidelines and he was like laughing, giggling. So I just think that's really important in a quarterback, and why some guys succeed and some fail is realizing that, yes, there's going to be big moments, but not letting the moment be too big. And obviously the blue and white game is not a big moment per se, but just the fact that, on that first series, he missed a couple throws, was behind his receivers. And that was something that kind of did pop up throughout the day, but just that he kind of just forgets about things and just goes on to the next play, which I think is really important. So, and really exciting for us Penn State fans.
Another edition of Locked On Nittany Lions in the books with special guest Pat Koerbler of Black Shoe Diaries, SB Nation. Pat, where can everyone keep up with all your great work? And if you want anything about Penn State men's basketball, check out Pat's writing over at Black Shoe Diaries.
Definitely, yeah. Just like Zach said, blackshoediaries.com is where you can find all my writing. And then if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it down on the bottom of the screen, but at Koerbler, Poerbler.
All right, Pat, thanks for the time. Can't wait to connect again and again. It's a fluid situation with Penn State men's basketball, so we could get the Kebba, Njie, Evan Mahaffey, all that news very soon. So excited for our next conversation. Thanks again for your time.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Zach.